What happened last week when we were talking about Norse mythology? They are not interdependent in the sense that you cannot understand one lecture without the other. In fact, they are quite independent. Last week, I wanted to give a lecture with a more historical focus, even though we ended up talking more about myths than history. But history, in the sense of providing a perspective on the sacred books, the main myths, the principal sagas, the magical universe, and the Norse world, and the philosophical logic that existed within this universe. There is, evidently, because it is a very complex set, which today, in fact, has become quite fashionable. Today, there is a strong resurgence of interest in this Scandinavian mythology. And today we'll talk about a principal myth, which is very complicated to discuss when it is described by 10 different sources. For those who attended the myth of King Arthur, I experienced this same dilemma, because there are about 10 sources and each one tells the story in a different way. 10 is actually few. When it comes to the myth of Hercules, there are far more than 10. Here, it's the same thing. There are so many sources telling a single story that we have to choose one version. So it's very possible, even likely, that you know some part of the story in a slightly different way. There's no way around it. We have to choose one path. But whichever path you take, whichever approach you choose, you will notice very interesting and recurring aspects of the myth. Elements that appear again and again. For example, the dragon guarding a treasure. Is there anything more recurring than that? A dragon guarding a treasure, wasn't that what Hercules faced when he had to retrieve the apples from the garden of the Hesperides? A dragon guarding a treasure, wasn't that also what Jason faced when he had to retrieve the golden fleece? In other words, the motif of a dragon guarding a treasure is very common. There must be some mystery, some secret, something meaningful behind this, which is not so different, for example, from what you find in pre-Columbian America, in the Aztec world, with Quetzalcoatl. What do you think of a dragon? Isn't it quite similar to a winged serpent? A serpent with wings? Quetzalcoatl is a winged serpent who also guarded a treasure, the treasure of civilization. He is the one who civilizes, the one who brings the elements of civilization to his people. Ultimately, myths are so recurrent because they speak of universal truths. I always mention in my lectures, and those who have attended have spoken about this quite a lot, it is as if there is a tree at the top of the mountain, and everyone is climbing, eager to discover what exists at the summit of that mountain. Everyone who reaches a certain height in this climb sees the same thing, a tree. Even though some speak in Quechua and others in Sanskrit, when you compare them, you see that they are referring to the same reality. That is where Carl Jung comes in. He shows us how much human symbolism, even in our dreams, is similar. The symbolic keys of the human unconscious, even in dreams, are alike. So we gather many recurring elements. In fact, the purpose of a myth within a school of philosophy is to show that all myths are speaking about the human saga, they are speaking about the human being. So, we'll see something very interesting here, in this particular myth, and today we'll tell a story. You might think it will end quickly, but don't get too excited, it's not that quick. It's actually quite a long story, the story of the Valkyries, of Siegfried, the story of Wagner's tetralogy. It is a single story, but a very long one. But we could say that, although it may seem so, the center of the story is not the ring itself, which was later so highly valued by Tolkien. The center of the story is not the dragon, even though it is quite striking. The center of the story is a human being who rises above the ordinary human condition. A human being who, as you will notice, is quite curious. There is a characteristic in this myth, an image that is deeply imprinted in our minds. Both the Valkyries and these heroes, like Sigrid and Sigmund, wear a helmet with wings. Don't think that's curious? Why are there wings on a hat? Why not on the back? Isn't this the right place to put wings? In fact, you will notice that this element, which characterizes goddesses like the Valkyries or marks special human beings like Siegfried, is directly related to something within the human mind that has wings. It is very similar to Athena, who emerges from within the head of God. It is believed that human beings possess two forms of thought. One form of thought is very material, very concrete. As it is said in the Indian tradition, the human mind is like a mirror. Sometimes it turns downward. And it only reflects material interests, instincts, mere survival. And it generates resources so that this survival can be achieved in the best possible way. This is a mind without wings. And when this mind turns upward, it reflects universal objectives, principles, fraternity, and values. This mind grows wings. In India, they called this kama manas, the mind of desires, this lower mind, turned downward. And manas, the pure mind, is the one with wings. This one that takes flight, this one that seeks nobler things. So, we will see a world where man is in transition between animal and human being. And when this human truly overcomes their trials, and will see which is the greatest of these trials. What is the greatest trial? Who here knows Siegfried and a bit of his story? Has anyone ever heard of him? What is the worst test Siegfried faces after winning? What is the greatest challenge? One of the greatest trials a human being can face is forgetfulness. Forgetfulness is his greatest trial. After he overcomes forgetfulness, after he regains his memory, after he reconnects with his divine soul, this world must be entirely absorbed and recreated on a new level for people like him. That world no longer serves people like him. Then comes the twilight of the gods, the Ragnarok. Basically, what is being discussed is a renewal of humanity, a recreation of humanity around new values. It is a very interesting and very powerful idea. Now, everywhere you look, what you will see are universal symbols, symbols that are used in all sorts of places. The apples of eternity. The apple, then, is something. In 9 out of 10 fairy tales, if there is a fruit, it is an apple. Have you ever seen another fruit in a fairy tale that wasn't an apple? The apple, and sometimes in various myths as well. So, there are many symbols here that are very recurrent, and we can draw some very interesting conclusions from them. Shall we continue? Let's then work a bit with the story, and a bit with the symbolism within the story, focusing on what we are able to decode. I would be lying, deceiving you, if I said that we are going to fully clarify a myth. Because, as Helena Blavatsky used to say, a myth is a house with at least 7 doors. You delve deeper into it as you delve deeper into yourself. And if someone tells you they will open all the doors of a myth for you, be careful, they are deceiving you. Because no one can force open your inner doors, and therefore cannot open the outer ones, since in nature, nothing is given for free. Even if the door is opened, you cannot enter, or if you do enter, you see nothing, because it is not an external achievement, but an internal one. So, what we will offer are some elements. All these mythology lectures, which I truly enjoy giving, are an invitation to rise up and say, I'll. Basically, I would say it is an invitation for you to realize that your life is a myth, that life is symbolic, and that we must learn to engage in dialogue with life, to decode what the symbols are trying to tell us. I often say that it is very difficult for a philosopher who does not have a symbolic mindset, because they do not engage in dialogue with their own life, and therefore it is unlikely that they will grow. If you think that life is just a jumble of random circumstances, it is unlikely that you will grow. So, as I mentioned to you, let me move this frame a little so I can position myself better. Here, I need to choose a version, and I have chosen one. A version by Richard Wagner himself, called The Ring of the Nibelung, which is the tetralogy. Wagner draws from an extraordinary number of sources and creates a blend, an amalgam. He takes a little from here, a little from there, and shapes it. We'll look at some of the sources he uses. There are others. I didn't include all of them so as not to overwhelm you with exotic names. From the Scandinavian sagas, because the names, the Icelandic ones, are very complicated. But basically, what he uses as a foundation to create this work, I have brought here. And in each section, sometimes he draws more from one work, sometimes from another, Germanic works, from Germanic mythology, Icelandic works such as the Volsunga saga. In other words, he creates a combination of elements. You may have already heard of it. Wagner reached the audacity when he created this work, which he considered his masterpiece, and, in fact, it is a grand musical drama. You cannot call The Ring of the Nibelung an opera, because that would offend Wagner. He would turn in his grave. It is much more than an opera. It is a magnificent musical drama. And so he takes it and connects. At first, he was only going to create one part, Siegfried, Freya. Then he adds another, the Ring of the Nibelung, the Rhine Gold. Then he adds Twilight of the Gods, then the Valkyrie. Altogether, 15 hours. This work is presented over 4 days at the Bayreuth Festival. 15 hours split over 4 days, they're not equal parts, the last day is the longest. So, it's 4 days, one after the other. And it's truly impressive, because it's said that if you want to buy a ticket, depending of the play you want to watch, as all Wagner is performed here. It's a theater that some of you here know well, built by Wagner to present his works, as nothing suitable existed at the time. The space and vastness his musical dramas needed, no theater was up to the task, in that place, as he envisioned. So he sought support from nobles, and in the end, he managed to build this theater. And to this day, since 1876, every year, every summer, this piece is performed in Bayreuth, that small town in Germany. If you want to watch the tetralogy in Bayreuth, you might have to wait 8 to 10 years in line. In other words, they serve about 60,000 people per year. So, you can imagine there are probably around 600,000 people waiting in line. So it's truly impressive, because it's a public success that renews itself every year and never ends. We'll see a scene from this marvelous theater where the tetralogy is performed. Of course, I am not from this field, so I won't go into details, but the purpose of this lecture is to talk about Wagner's work. But rather about the story, the narrative he created as an amalgamation of all this mythology and, to the extent possible, a little bit about its essence, about its symbolic meaning. So, Wagner's tetralogy, which is composed of these 4 parts, the Rheingold, the Valkyrie, Siegfried, and Twilight of the Gods. The script is written by him, revised by him, and he is practically responsible for everything within the work. So, the Rheingold is based primarily on the poetic Edda. You may remember that we discussed here last week that there are the Eddas in verse and the Eddas in prose. This one was translated quite late. The Valkyrie draws heavily from the Icelandic Volsunga saga. The Volsunga saga is the foundation for the Valkyrie, which is the second part. Siegfried is based on the prose Edda, the Edda of Snorri, also in verse, but primarily on Snorri's Edda, which is the prose Edda, as well as on the Song of the Nibelung, which is a collection of Germanic stories, a set of Germanic myths. Twilight of the Gods, which is the final part, draws heavily from the Song of the Nibelung, also from the Eddas, but also from the Germanic mythology compiled by the renowned writer Jacob Grimm, which was published in 1835. Furthermore, there are about half a dozen more names, poems, and epics that he draws upon, such as Rhys Kriemhild, the Vikina saga, and many other names as straightforward as these. A multitude of poems are used, combined, and woven together by him to construct this narrative. So, we'll follow Wagner's storyline. Of course, each of these stories has its own unique features and does not exactly match his narrative. But Wagner's version is very comprehensive and far-reaching, because when you look at, for example, the Volsunga saga or any of these Germanic songs, like the Song of the Nibelung, they are very regional. Wagner gives the work a universal tone. He removes very minor elements and infuses the work with a human dimension. So, it is truly fascinating to work with Wagner's version, which is fundamentally rooted in the mythological tradition. Look how beautiful it is. The theater. Isn't it worth waiting 8 to 10 years? A beautiful theater, an experience that would truly be worth living in one's lifetime, wouldn't it? To watch this play in that theater. Wagner's dream in the theater he envisioned. Well, the Rheingold, which is the first part. Let us begin to imagine the setting, everything Wagner dreamed of, everything all these. These mythologies that have been kept alive throughout the centuries. The Rheingold tells us that there were 3 nymphs who guarded a treasure, a gold that lay at the bottom of this river, the Rhine. And they would bathe and sing, and, like all nymphs, like all elementals, very beautiful, this treasure remained beneath the river. And people had never tried to steal it. They were guardians, but they had a certain carefreeness, because there was a secret. A very high price for anyone who tried to steal the Rheingold. Anyone who stole the Rhine gold would have to solemnly renounce love for their entire life. Since this was an extremely high and costly price, generally, no matter how ambitious the aspirant was, they would not go that far. So, the nymphs were a little afraid that this gold might be stolen. Remember that we discussed in our last lecture that, in general, there is a fundamental symbol in most myths, water and fire. One as horizontality, which is matter, and the other as verticality, linked to spirit, spiritual mind luminous, vertical, and transformative. So, water when things are submerged in water, as with King Arthur, the sword plunges in, disappears, swallowed by materialism. So, it is the riches that are swallowed up by the world, material, the riches of the world, material wealth, which in order for you to possess, you would have to renounce true love. So they live there, they play, and they are not very afraid. Until, at a certain point, a dwarf appears. This is an interesting moment, because you will see that this myth contains a bit of everything: rings, giants, all kinds of beings. It is a mythology that is very rich in elementals, as we discussed in the previous class. These dwarves, they lived in the underground realms of the earth. There was even a certain prejudice toward those who lived on the surface. They called those who lived on the surface, the uncovered ones, the uncovered. Those who had nothing to cover their homes. In a certain way, as if this symbolized a being that does not wish to have any contact with the sky. In other words, it is the coarsest and most fallen form into matter that a being can have. So material, so bent over into matter. The dwarves were stooped, tied to material world. And this dwarf, who was Alberich, until then was insignificant, holding no power among the world of the dwarves. At a certain point, he passes through this place, and he sees these three beautiful nymphs. Alberich was not handsome, definitely not. Beauty standard was dwarf. And he arrives and falls in love with those nymphs. Nymphs are, by definition, incredibly beautiful beings, and he begins to flirt with them, and they also start to joke, mocking him. Because, in truth, it is rather ridiculous that three such beautiful beings would be, so to speak, courted by a misshapen being like a dwarf. And they tease him, mock him, pretending to be interested only to then reject him. He feels deeply offended by this. Suddenly, he sees a golden glow coming from the bottom of the river and asks them, "What is that?" You don't know. Everyone knows what that is. That is the Rhine gold. We are here to guard it. We are the guardians of the Rhine gold. He says, "Wow, gold at the bottom of the river like that. No one takes it, no one steals it." She replies, "That's because this gold. Whoever takes possession of it must renounce love for the rest of their life, and no one would make such a trade." Can you imagine the situation? He is a deformed dwarf who had just been rejected by the nymphs, offended, feeling like he didn't have much of a chance at love, but he did have a chance to seize all that gold. He doesn't hesitate, he climbs up onto a rock and solemnly declares to the four winds, "I renounce love." And, by renouncing love, he dives into the river, takes the Rhine gold, and leaves with it. And the nymphs are left in despair, because they never imagined that something like this could happen. So, this Alberich, who is one of those dwarves called the Nibelungsto you remember from last week. Nibelung, Nibelheim, the mist, the land of mist. The Nibelungs are the children of the mist, which already gives you a sense of the symbolism involved. Fog isn't clear, it's not very sharp in other words, it relates to ignorance, to blurred vision. They are children of blurred vision, of a shadowy world that had no contact with the heavens. And so Alberich arrives with this gold, in the underground realm where he lived, which was the land of the Nibelungs, and he finds himself endowed with great power, because it seems that this gold was special and possessed great powers. He had a brother, who was a great blacksmith, named Mime. And this Mime, he asks his brother to forge for him, first of all, a ring, and then to forge a helmet. This helmet would grant him the powers of invisibility and transformation, because this gold already possessed powers. So, when he creates this marvelous helmet, it is endowed with the power to take on any form he wishes and also to remain invisible, if he so desires. So, with this ring which channeled a lot of power and inspired terror in people and this helmet that made him invisible, he simply enslaved all the dwarves, including his own brother, who had crafted these two items for him. He forces all the dwarves to become his slaves, burrowing through the earth, mining and gathering gold for him. So, that initial gold he turned into the helm and the ring, that magical gold from the Rhine, he keeps gathering more and more gold. He enslaves his brother and all the dwarves. Since he could become invisible, everyone was afraid to criticize him, as he could be listening anywhere. He is harsh and cruel, so he becomes a tyrant of the underground, the land of the Nibelungs, a little king there, and extremely wealthy. The dwarves begin to produce gold endlessly. For him, this comes from the power he acquires. So, this is the beginning of the story. Of this Nibelung, child of the mist in other words, of ignorance completely disconnected from the heavens and owner of a gold, which is this worldly power. This makes him utterly blind, causing him to renounce any form of higher, nobler, or true love. He is driven only by desires, and they live buried deep within the earth, amassing more and more wealth. This was Alberich. So, this is how our story begins. The construction of Valhalla. Meanwhile, remember that all of this is happening down here, in Midgard, the land of humans, Middle Earth, as Tolkien would say. And up above, we have Asgard, the land of the gods. And Odin, at a certain point, decided that he needed to have a palace worthy of receiving his warriors who had fallen in battle. Because, for him, it was essential to constantly encourage men to become heroes. And heroes needed to have a reward in the afterlife. They could not arrive in Asgard and simply find a meadow which, although beautiful, was not grand enough to be the dwelling place of a hero. He dreamed of having a castle. Its walls would be covered with spears and its roof adorned with shields. A place where his bravest warriors could dine with him, Odin, every day, engage in endless battles, and eternally cultivate heroism until the moment came when they would have to fight alongside the gods and be truly prepared. He dreamed of this castle, but Odin noticed this, because these beings, the gods of Norse mythology, have their limitations. They grow old, they die, they have flaws, and they seek to improve themselves. Odin is always searching for self-improvement in some way. So, Odin would not have been able to build this castle. It was a truly magnificent work, and he had no skill for it. There were the giants, some of whom were highly skilled builders. Fafnir and Fasolt, in particular, were two giants who lived in the land of the giants, which was Jotunheim, and they were very talented. It's interesting because we talked about this: they live at war with the giants, but sometimes they marry the giants, sometimes they hire the giants, sometimes Thor visits the giants. So, it's a war, but not really much. There is an interaction between them. The giants represent all that immense greed, those overwhelming desires, those elements from the past that should have already been overcome. So, they are placed at the edge of the earth and watched, so that they do not invade humanity again. They are kept at the margins of the land and guarded so that they do not come back to dominate humankind. But at that moment, Fafnir acted. He had people build this castle for him. He hires the giants. Then the giants demand an outrageous price. They say the following: "Look, for us to build this castle for you, there is only one possible payment, which is the goddess of love, Freya. She is the Aphrodite of the Scandinavians. But there is still a particular detail. She is the goddess of love and beauty, but she was also responsible for gathering the apples that granted the gods their immortality. The gods were not immortal by themselves. They had to be nourished by these apples of immortality, otherwise they would age and die. In other words, the gods were mortal, so much so that they actually die in the end. They are mortal. So, imagine if they give in, they lose not only the goddess of love, but also their youth and their lives, which was unthinkable." Then Odin says, "No, not at that price." The giants say, "That is the only price." There's a character in this story that we talked about last week, Loki, or Loge in this Germanic version, who is the god of fire, the god of the mind. And as I mentioned to you, the mind is dual. Sometimes it destroys, sometimes it builds, so no one can say whether Loki is positive or negative, because he is both. Loki sometimes causes terrible things and sometimes does wonderful things, because he is the most ingenious of the gods. So Odin will call Loki Wotan. Here, using the Germanic method, he asks Loki, "What should I do with these people? They just want me to pay myself. Breaks." He says, "Look, don't worry about that. It's a simple matter. You just say the following: set a deadline that they will never be able to meet. Then you say you won't give up Freya because they didn't finish the construction within the deadline. That's it. Then you give them something else, and they'll have to be satisfied, because if they break a pact, set a deadline that's impossible to meet for them to deliver this castle the way you want. Do you think it's going to work?" "It will. No worries, no worries. Go ahead." So they write it down. He has a spear where the pacts are sealed, Wotan, who is Gunther, and they write there the pact that was made, and Wotan signs it. Because if they fulfilled it within a certain deadline, he would hand over Freya. Just imagine. And wouldn't you know it, they actually fulfill it. They had to fulfill it, right? To make the story even more complicated. They bring all their magical powers, their magical horse from Jotunheim, they do everything, and they actually succeed. Their desire, in truth, was for Freya, but it was also to see the gods grow old. Because the giants were the immortal enemies of the gods. So, they do everything they can and manage to capture Freya. It's interesting, if we observe, as I mentioned to you, the story of the apples. I once had a very funny experience. One time, a student asked me, why apples in mythology? Why so many apples? Apple in Garden of Eden, apple in Snow White, why not other fruit? What do you think? A pineapple, maybe a watermelon? Goodbye. Why do you think that is? Does anyone have any idea why the apple is used as a symbol in these mythologies? All of them? But why her? Depending on your taste, I personally don't like apples. But what does it resemble? Symbolically, it represents the heart. It is the symbol of the heart. It is in this divine heart of Freya, which represents divine love, that immortality is demanded. If you lose this ability that Freya has to channel divine love through the heart, you lose eternity. In other words, their eternity was a constant achievement made possible through Freya's heart, and it could be lost. And, in fact, at a certain point, they will lose it. So, the giants arrived there right on time. One day, Wotan and Fricka, his wife, wake up lying on the meadows, as they were, because until then they had no residence. When they look, there is the castle. It's something indescribable, gigantic, wonderful, everything they had dreamed of and more. And the giants are there, payment, payday. And now, what do we do? Exactly within the deadline. Then Wotan tries to change the subject, but look, it's written there on your spear and signed. You made this pact with us. And Fricka, who was his wife, finds herself in a very difficult situation because she was the lady of the pacts. She had to oversee and ensure the fulfillment of the pacts. But the problem was that Freya was her sister, and she didn't want to give her up. A delicate situation with the existence of the gods at stake. So, what do you do? What don't you do? Call Loki, because he's the one who got me into this mess. Loki or Loge, here he comes. So, what are we supposed to do with this now? You're the one responsible, so you'd better find a solution. He always finds a way, and he says, wait, I'll travel the world and look for something those two want more than Freya. Because there is Freya, the guardian of the apples of eternity, of eternal youth. So, Loge or Loki sets out, wandering the world. And he searches and searches, but finds nothing until finally he comes upon, where, there, in the house of the Nibelungs. The Rhine gold, the magical gold of the Rhine, is that Manuel Bandera of gold. Besides that, he says, maybe. Those giants are greedy, they're ambitious, who knows? And you know, faced with all that gold, when they see it, wanting to know about Freya, they want to trade her. He goes back to Asgard and Odin is there. Wotan is out of patience, not knowing what to do. And he arrives and says, I found a solution. And the giants, also impatient, say, what solution? We're taking Freya, and that's final. Wait, hold on, let's all stay calm in this moment. There's something you'll like even more than Freya. The Rhine gold. And, in addition to the Rhine gold, all the gold that was mined from the Nibelung's mansion. A mountain of gold. Then the giants say, wait a minute, the Rhine gold, because they knew it was endowed with magical powers. And another mountain of gold. Well, hold on, let's think about this, let's take it slow, we'll see the terms of the agreement. But how much gold is that? It's a lot of gold. Well, only accepted on one condition. If this gold, piled up in front of the goddess Freya, completely covers her figure, in such a way that we can't see a single strand of her hair. If we see even a single golden hair of Freya, it will refer back to her. And then, that's fine. This is also interesting and symbolic. When the riches of the world, which are the divine gold, completely cover divine love, in such a way that not even a single strand of hair can be seen, an era of decline and materialism begins, an era of trials. Well, so they agree, and you will see that they are about to set out. Both of them, Wotan himself and Loge, head to the dwelling of the Nibelungs, the disguised ones. Go there to try to find Alberich, and try to take the gold from him, because there will be no way to negotiate. They really have to take it. They arrive there, Loge and the saving solution. They descend through the Bifrost Arch, which is the rainbow, and thus they go to the dwelling of the Nibelungs. The two of them are there. When they arrive and go inside, they see the dwarves' Slaveria horrifying scene, dwarves under the whip, gathering gold endlessly. Then, when they arrive, they manage to speak with Alberich. Alberich becomes very proud to see the king of the gods himself in his dwelling. Ah, I came here because I heard about your treasure, so magnificent that it is. Ah, how wonderful. The king of the gods in my home. Puffed up with pride at the honor, Odin then looks to a corner and sees the magical helmet that makes its wearer invisible, a true work of art, so masterfully crafted. He says, wow, what a marvelous helmet. I have never seen anything like it. He says, wow, it truly is very beautiful. My brother made it, and it has special powers. And then Loge, who was very sharp, looks at that plim, and it's shining. What is that? Odin, are you kidding? You have half a dozen helmets more beautiful than this one. I must have at least 12. At the very least, because this is just an ordinary helmet, nothing special about it. Are you trying to flatter the dwarf, trying to butter him up? This dwarf's helmet is just ordinary. Why are you belittling my helmet? Is it the most beautiful on earth? The most beautiful in the land? You must be joking. Even the simplest of my helmets must be better than this one. And Wotan's helmets, there's no comparison at all. Then the little dwarf, enraged, right? You have no idea about the powers this helmet possesses. Powers? What kind of powers does it have? It makes me invisible. Big deal. You're already so small that you're practically invisible. It wouldn't make much of a difference. No, but that's not all. What do you mean, that's not all? What else does it do? It allows me to transform into anything. Do you want to see? Want to see? Then he puts on the helmet and transforms into a huge dragon, breathing fire in every direction. The gods hide themselves. Then he returns to his original form. See? Well, I think it's just okay, you know. It didn't really convince me, to be honest. Why weren't you convinced? Turning into a dragon is such a cliché, you have to admit. Everyone turns into a dragon, expands, grows. Easy. Any ordinary wizard can turn into those huge creatures. Let's see if you can, with your soul, do something harder like becoming a tiny creature. Good. Now we're talking. Respect your helmet if you do this. Ah, leave it to me, leave it to me. So he puts on the helmet and turns into a frog. No doubt about it. Of course, poof, a foot comes down on the frog's head. And they take the helmet from him, strip him of everything, and tie him up. He returns to his original form when the helmet is removed and becomes a prisoner. It's a lot like Puss in Boots, remember? It's reminiscent of Puss in Boots, more or less the same plot. He imprisons Alberich. And then, Alberich, what do you want? Well, see the helmet and all the Nibelung gold. We want you to gather your dwarves and bring everything up the Bifrost so we can take it all to Asgard. Then Alberich thinks to himself, well, as long as they don't take the ring from me, I can rebuild everything. He keeps to himself, right? Then they start going up, They ascend the Bifrost Bridge, and when they get to the top, the dwarves, the giants, are already extremely impatient. So they begin to pile the gold in front of Freya. They keep piling it up, more and more, until they make a mountain of gold in front of her. And still, it's not enough. You can still see a bit of her hair, so they add the helmet. Then it seems like everything is fine. They look and carefully examine that mountain of gold. Suddenly, they notice there's a small gap, where you can still see one of Freya's eyes shining through from behind. No, with that little gap, it won't do. They need more gold. They look around, and the only gold they see is a ring. The ring, which is on Alberic's finger, they say, that ring can cover it. Not the ring, under no circumstances. And with all that commotion, they realize the ring must be something special. They take off the ring and place it there. Meanwhile, it's interesting because when Wotan takes the ring, he senses that the ring is something extraordinary. He himself feels intoxicated by the power of the ring, and he himself hesitates to give up the ring. He goes through his own trial. Then the earth goddess, the goddess Hera, appears and says, "Look, this ring will be a curse for whoever possesses it, so give it up." And Alberic himself says, "Cursed is the one who possesses this ring." And so, the ring, which was already forged from gold that was itself cursed, becomes doubly cursed. Then it is placed, fitted into that small crevice, and no one sees Freya anymore. The dwarves are pleased. But before they leave, not the dwarves, the giants, before the giants leave with their reward, the ring already claims its first victim. The two of them, each of the giant brothers, wants to keep the ring for himself. They start fighting and fighting until Fafnir kills his own brother and takes the ring for himself. Then Odin transforms him into a dragon and sends him to a cave in the earth, where he is meant to guard the ring. He descends to the earth and remains there, guarding this treasure, this cursed ring, which brought misfortune, because as soon as they received him, a murder happened. One brother died. And so, Fafnir is transformed into a dragon and remains in a cave on earth, guarding this cursed treasure, this wealth that brings so much misfortune and will not stop, will not cease to bring harm until it finally finds its place again in the bed of the Rhine. In other words, things do not cease to generate harm until each one finds its proper place. Justice is when everything finds its place, as Plato said. So, more or less, this is the point in the story where we are, moving a bit further through the scenes. Fade out. The handing over of the ring to the dwarves. This is Freya. Do you see that they are dragging her? I call the giants dwarves, but they're giants Fafnir and Fasolt. And the dragon? So, this dragon, for his entire life, as long as Alberic lives, he schemes to find a way to get the ring with the help of this dragon. He doesn't succeed, he dies, and that's the end of it. His brother, who was a blacksmith, ends up living very close to the dragon's cave. And he keeps trying to find a way to take that ring from the dragon. How? A cowardly, weak, small dwarf. How could he possibly steal a ring from a dragon? He keeps imagining that he would need to find someone else to do it for him. A hero, a grand being who could accomplish this on his behalf. And so he lives in anticipation, hoping to achieve this, while living very close to the dragon's cave. As I was telling you, dragons, guarding treasures everywhere, are a recurring theme in mythology. Dragons are considered the forces of nature, this immense power of nature, which at a certain point is challenged when things are taken out of their rightful place. So it's very common. Remember the King Arthur myth. Merlin invokes the breath of the dragon, so that Uther can change his form and unite with a grain. It is always this force of nature which can be manipulated, which can be used by humans at certain moments. And it is the guardian of all the material riches of the world. Here again is the dragon. Do you remember, even in Chinese tradition, in China on the other side of the world, the dragon holds a pearl in its hand, which represents the manifested universe. In other words, precisely the forces of nature, the forces of the manifested universe. These forces can be invoked, can be worked with intelligently, but they can also cause great harm to those who do not know how to coexist with them. They can bring about much destruction, which is exactly what happens when we act against nature. It is as if we are playing with the breath of the dragon. So, this is where our story stands up to this point. Then begins the second part, the Valkyrie. There are 9 of them, and this one is Woden's favorite. Brunhild. She is the bravest, the most upright. But it is interesting because they were goddesses, daughters of this earth goddess, who is Hera with Wotan. And because they were goddesses, they did not have much understanding of human nature, of the limitations of human beings, of human suffering, of the glory and pain experienced by humanity. At some point, one of them had to descend, to fall among men. It is as if a divine soul must, at a certain moment, be united with humanity. She must be joined with a human being. It was necessary for one of these Valkyries to become human. And then it will happen. You will notice that it is the thread of life that leads in this direction. In a certain way, it is as if Wotan, from the very beginning, already knew everything that was going to happen, and he himself confesses to her that, from the start, he already knew what was going to happen. It might have seemed absurd to humans, but for him, it was a plan that had been drawn since the dawn of time. So, this Valkyrie and her sisters, there are 9 of them in total, were responsible for taking the warriors. Those who died heroically on the battlefield and bringing them to Valhalla. Seeing a Valkyrie meant death. He would die in a glorious manner. Therefore, it was an honor. It was the greatest vision a man could have. It meant that he would have a glorious death and that he would go with Wotan to Valhalla. At a certain moment, these Valkyries are summoned for a very special mission, which is what we'll see in the second part of this drama. Wotan becomes saddened by the lack of virtue among men. Midgard was inhabited either by twisted dwarves of dubious character, too weak, or by men who lived on the surface, a little better than the dwarves, but still very clumsy, very coarse, focused simply on survival. Materialistic, instinctive, and crude. These men were called nadings. These nadings, who were the common men, were people who had no chance, no honor, no possibility of fighting by his side. To be able to battle the giants at Ragnarok. They were unworthy men, men without glory, without honor, without greatness. He dreams of a better humanity. He keeps imagining what that could be like. He takes the form of a wolf, the else or wolf, and wanders through the forests of the world. Searching for a woman who was above average, someone a bit more noble, a bit more dignified and honorable, with whom he could have children. A physical woman. For the gods, this would be considered the height of indignity, because human beings were seen as very crude creatures. And he meets a woman, the old myth of the virgin pure, noble, and exalted, who conceives from a divine being. He finds this woman, who was a very special woman, and unites with her. And, by uniting with her, as the else or the wolf, he has 2 children, who are known as the Sungos, the sons of the wolf, 2 twin brothers. 2 soulmate souls, Sigmund and Sieglund. He does not only have these 2 children, because here it is very similar to Greek mythology. His wife, do you remember what it was like to endlessly chase after God's infidelities? Which, by the way, is not at all easy to deal with Fricka. She is constantly pursuing, while he protects his children, protects his human family, and he educates the boys, he lives with them. So, constantly, he goes with his son, Sigmund, into the forest to hunt. To teach him. This wolf mythology is also very well known, isn't it, everyone? The one who howls at the light of the moon, because you know that the moon does not have its own light. The light of the moon is the light of the sun fallen into the night of time, as if humanity perceives the sunlight in the dark night of the ages. In other words, it is the light of the spirit in the dark night of matter, and it howls at it, recognizes it. So, this is a symbol of a very spiritual being, even though it has fallen into the night of time. You will see that in Rome there was an entire fraternity, which was precisely the fraternity of the Salii warriors, who dressed in wolf cloaks. The wolf was considered a special animal in various mythologies. So this is Sigmund, who has a twin sister, who is Sieglund. When he goes out, then, with his father to hunt, to howl, to the moon, through the forest and everything his father teaches him, the idea was to create two very special human beings. One time, those natings, that is, those envious, rude, beastly people, there was one thing they couldn't stand: the Belsungos. Why is that, huh? For a coarse man, a noble man is unbearable. What? Do you think? Do you notice how much it exposes? Their mediocre side. Nobility is deeply unsettling because awareness is born through contrast. If all you have is mediocrity, none of the mediocre will ever be able to realize just how mediocre they are. But if you place a noble person among the mediocre, can you see how, through contrast, it becomes apparent? I always joke with my students about that day when, as a child, you arrived at school. I think everyone has gone through this, or almost everyone. You studied for the test, and your classmates were furious with you. Why is that? If no one had studied and everyone had gotten a 0, the blame would have fallen on the teacher, right? But if you studied, you exposed the whole class because you showed that it was possible to get a good grade. It was possible. The others were simply lazy. In other words, when someone has value, they reveal the mediocrity around them. There is a modern writer, Stephen Preston, who speaks about this very well. I find it quite interesting. He says that there is a tacit agreement in favor of mediocrity. When someone reacts, they are seen as a traitor. And this reaction is often aggressive. And this is exactly what happened in that historical moment. The Welsungs were hated by everyone. Their nobility exposed the weakness of the others. Last year, I gave a lecture on Art Day where I showed that film Amadeus, and I talked about Salieri. Do you remember that scene where Salieri suffers terribly because Mozart's greatness exposes his own mediocrity, exposes his smallness? So it is always like this. Historically, it is always like this. He constantly reveals the greatness that makes us feel small. This is what Salieri says about Mozart. It's more or less the same thing. So, these Welsung brothers were hated. They were a small family despised by everyone. On one occasion, while they were in the forest, their house was invaded, their mother was killed, and their sister was kidnapped and disappeared with her. And when they returned, they were attacked, and the father and son were separated in such a way that they never saw each other again. In other words, they completely destroy the family. They try to kill the boy, but fail. He escapes and hides deep in the forest. And so, they are separated. The entire family is destroyed. The siblings never see each other again. The father never sees his son again, and that's how it remains as the years go by. Son, I remain unclean, wandering through the forest. Looking for his father and sister, because his mother is dead, he tries to find family. To make things more complicated, whenever he arrived somewhere and saw injustice, he would get involved. He would help, he would support, and in the end, everyone would turn against him, resenting his strength and heroism. Along the way, he continued to make enemies. He arrives where a young woman was forced to marry. He intervenes. All the brothers turn against him. He kills them. The young woman turns against him too. It's endless chaos. He keeps getting into trouble. All of this happens precisely because of his habit of always wanting to stand on the side of what is just in a world where justice did not exist. In the end, everyone turns against him. So, after wandering for a long time, searching endlessly, already exhausted and somewhat hopeless, one night Sigmund arrives deep in the heart of the forest. There was a duty of hospitality that was highly respected in many of these ancient cultures. He hoped to find someone, perhaps a humble peasant, someone who could offer him shelter for a night because he was exhausted and hungry. And then he comes across a small house. And this little house is attached. It is built right up against the trunk of a monumental tree, unlike anything he had ever seen before, which was none other than Yggdrasil, the great ash tree that connects all the worlds. And the house was leaning against it. He looks at that little house, sees a bit of light inside. It seemed there was a fire burning. He thinks, "I'll knock. Maybe the people there will welcome me. Maybe they'll let me stay the night so I can leave in the morning." And he knocks. And when he knocks, a young woman opens the door. He is a bit taken aback. They do not recognize each other, yet they are identical. They were twins, but they did not recognize each other. Yet, instinctively, they felt something special for one another. She explained that her husband had gone out hunting, but she was certain that when he returned, out of a sense of hospitality, he would allow the traveler to spend the night there. So, she asked him to wait a little while. Soon her husband Hunding, a brutal hunter, arrives. And Hunding, who is no fool, upon arriving and looking at them, notices that the two look exactly alike. They are very similar. Nevertheless, he invites the young man to sit at the table, and they begin to converse. Sigmund, after a long journey, knocks on the door and finds Siglinde, his sister. And after so many years, they do not recognize each other. He sits at the table with the brutal giant, Hunding. Siglinde had been forced to marry this man. He was a very coarse, very vulgar man, from a family of men who were also very coarse and vulgar. She had been married against her will, forced into this union, and lived in great unhappiness. After all, she was a Welsung, and this man was crude, an ordinary man. And then, when her unknown brother sits at the table, her husband begins to ask questions, and he starts to reveal who he is. Very innocently, he says, "Well, I'm a Welsung, I'm the son of the wolf. I have been wandering the earth searching for my father, searching for my sister. Recently, I passed by a house, fought with several brothers in order to save a young woman. Many died, I was greatly worn out by it, and I have been walking ever since." And then, the hunter becomes enraged and says to him, "Look, I'm a mortal enemy of all the Welsungs, for I was part of that family whose brothers you killed. I was one of the cousins who came there to avenge the death of my relatives. I hate the Welsungs. Therefore, I'll fulfill my duty of hospitality. Tomorrow, after you have spent the night in my house, since it is my duty to receive you, you had better find yourself a weapon, because I'll fight you to the death. Tonight you may rest well, but find a weapon, because as soon as day breaks, I'll challenge you to a fight to the death." And so it is done. He goes to his room and asks his wife to serve him a warm drink. And there is Siglinde, who had witnessed all of this. She was hopelessly in love with the young man she didn't know, and he with her, obviously. He reveals himself, EU so the son of Welsung, EU so the son of the wolf. It was the worst thing he could have said. The worst thing a man could be in this context. There she is. She puts a potion into her husband's drink, so that he will fall into a deep sleep. While he sleeps deeply, she goes to the living room to speak with the stranger. She tells him about her unhappiness, about how she had been taken away when she was still very young, about how unhappy she was and how she had been forced into this marriage. And she is concerned about him because, in truth, he needed a weapon and she knew how he could obtain one. In that moment of despair, he remembers his father had said that, in his most desperate moment, his father, the wolf Wotan, would send him an invincible weapon. And so the two of them are talking in the living room. And he tells her this story, that his father had promised him an invincible weapon. She says, "Look, when I got married, in the midst of that terrible ceremony in which I was forced to marry, a stranger entered my house, right in the middle of the ceremony. A man with a hat, with a drooping brim, a very strange man. And this man, without saying a word, entered the house and drove a gigantic sword he was carrying into this tree, all the way to the hilt. And he simply said that one day a hero would appear who would remove this weapon from there. Everyone has tried, and no one has been able to pull it out. Curious, isn't it? A Scandinavian Excalibur. Exactly the same symbol, the symbol of willpower embedded in the axis of the world, Woden's sword that was destined for Sigmund." Then she says, "Why don't you try? Many have already tried. Who knows, maybe you can do it." So Sigmund, with all the determination of someone who truly believed it was his father's legacy, goes there and manages to pull out the sword not hung from the world ash tree. The axis mundi as it is called, the axis that connects all worlds, and the sword of will that was embedded there. It is a divine sword, a divine will, powerful. And then he takes this sword and, together with his own sister, they decide to flee. Both, in love, decide to run away. Knowing her husband would come after them, the fight would be terrible, no escape. So they leave, they flee, and spend that night together. And when Hunding wakes up the next morning, he obviously sees that his wife has been taken, which was quite predictable, and he sets out in pursuit. And all of this is happening on Earth. In other words, the man managed to awaken his will and found his soulmate. But for this man to truly become a hero, he still needed to find something more. He needed to find a divine, higher soul. So, for those who have watched the myth of King Arthur, you may remember that it was very common for heroes to die and for their children to continue their saga. This was the spell of transmutation. So, Uther becomes Arthur, Lancelot becomes Parsifal. The same thing will happen here, and Sigmund is still not the perfect man for the saga that lies ahead. He needs to unite with a divine soul, with a divine being. He needs to discover that which is divine within himself. In other words, he is reborn, purified in his son. The child of this union between two pure souls, two soulmates, children of the gods, daughters of the gods. So, he unites with Sieglind and she becomes pregnant with a child. Meanwhile, what was happening in the heavens, in Asgard? Wotan calls his favorite daughter, Brunhilde, the most perfect of the Valkyries, the bravest, the most intrepid, and says, "Look, a terrible fight is about to happen, a battle between my son, who is still young, very young, Siegmund, and this peasant, who is a brute and much stronger than he is. I want you to protect him, I want you to save my children." And she doesn't waste any words. She mounts her horse Grain in one of the most beautiful moments of Wagner's work, The Ride of the Valkyries. She gets on her horse Grain and charges ahead. Let's go. She doesn't think twice. But on the way, as she is heading out, Fricka appears and says, "Look, no, you cannot interfere. There is a pact here." She was married. She had a matrimonial pact. She abandons her own husband to unite with her brother, and this breaks all the laws of the earth. "I'm the guardian of the laws of the earth, and I will not allow you to protect these two. You must leave them to their own fate. They have broken the laws of the earth and must reap the fruits of the earth, that is, to face the punishment for what they have done. I will not let you interfere. You are going against the very laws that are inscribed on your spear." He had a spear, which was Gunther, where all the laws of the world were inscribed. "You cannot oppose this, therefore, I do not allow you to interfere." Frigg was the one who built the bridge between Wotan, the spiritual world, and the earthly world. She was the guardian of these pacts, these laws that had to be fulfilled for the good order of humanity. And also, just like you'll see in Greece, Hera, who so often pursued the heroes, but was also responsible for their elevation to nobility, Hera herself, who is the glory of Hera. If he hadn't been persecuted by Hera, would he be the same? Likewise, Aeneas, persecuted by Juno, if he hadn't been, would he be the same? Here as well, Frigg occupies this role, as if she were subjecting the follower to trials, so that he might be purified and become the perfect hero. She is always responsible for these trials, this lady, this mistress of pacts who accompanies the greatest of the gods. So, she does not allow it. And Wotan had already sent Brunhild into the world, but he calls Brunhild back and says, "Look, do not interfere." But how can I not interfere? There is a pact that has been broken, there are laws that have been violated, and you cannot interfere. This young woman broke a marital pact and united herself with her own brother. In short, there are a number of elements in which I cannot interfere. She must experience her own destiny. And Brunhilde, which is a curious moment that you will notice, in a certain way, Wotan already knew about this. She is living out a very ancient myth here, almost like the myth of the fallen angels. She rebels against her own father, which was something unthinkable. But the Valkyrie was an extension of Odin himself, of Wotan himself. She rebels against her own father. She does not understand the justice of it all. She no longer had a cold heart, distant from the earth. She had learned to love humanity, with all its dramas and its suffering. And this compels her to live among them. So she descends and decides to disobey her own father. When she arrives, she finds Siglinde asleep. At Sigmundo's knees, she says, "Look, you are going to lose the battle. There is nothing I can do, there is not much I can do." He says, "Then it is better for Siglinde to die, because we will die together." She does not allow him to kill Siglinde and says, "No, let me take care of her." And then, soon after, Hunding arrives and the battle between the two begins. And since the sword was a divine sword, forged by divine will from divine steel, Nibelung could not be defeated, and Sigmundo begins to gain the upper hand. But then, at a certain moment, Odin himself appears and places his spear, Gungnir, in the middle of the battle. When the Nibelung sword strikes the spear, it splits it, breaking the unbreakable. That will which oppose the laws of the world is divided, it is broken. The sword breaks, splitting into two pieces, and both of them die in this battle, both Hunding and Sigmund himself. And then, immediately, Brunhilde takes the young Sieglind, goes with her to her sisters, and asks for their help to protect the young expectant mother, who was already carrying a child. And she knew that from there, someone very special would be born. So she leaves and goes to her sisters. This is the moment when she arrives with Sieglind. Together with the other Valkyries, the Valkyries do not understand. They did not possess what she had. She had warmed her heart by bringing it closer to the hearts of humankind. They are insensitive. You are disobeying Odin's orders. You must abandon this young woman. You protect your actions. You have lost your mind, and now there is no turning back. Her destiny, the destiny of humankind, is one and the same. And she decides to help Sieglind at any cost. Where will I put this young woman? In a place where no one can harm her. Where no one will go. Where no one will disturb her. What place in the world will she be safe there? There is a place, nice, but nobody goes nor passes by. It's right next to the dragon's cave. Who would dare to wander into a dragon's cave? That is the place where she will be safe. So she takes Sieglind, gathers the two pieces of the sword, not hung, wraps them in a veil, places the pregnant Sieglind there, gives her the sword, and says, "Look, give this to your son when he is born. He will know what to do with it." She already foresaw the future. After doing this, after leaving Sieglind protected, she goes to meet her father to receive the punishment that was already expected. It is then the moment when she stands before her father to hear her sentence. There is a beautiful engraving of Brunhilde. Her depictions are all beautiful, every one of them. And he decides to condemn her to the human condition. She truly becomes a fallen angel. She falls among men to live the experience of humanity. But more than that, she lives a bit of the tale of sleeping beauty. She will be placed in the world, asleep. And the first man who kisses her will marry her. She is horrified by this and begs her father that, at the very least, it be a worthy man, a hero. He grants her this request. He then places a wall of fire around her, towering flames, in such a way that only a great man, only a hero, only a Welsung could overcome that barrier. And so she falls asleep, lying on a stone, in the midst of a wall of fire, awaiting the hero who would come to awaken her. It was already predestined. And in that cave, then, next, who lived near the dragon's cave? Notice that this question, the flames, as I mentioned to you, are always closely associated with the mind. Who is capable of overcoming this luminous, transformative fire? Only a true hero. Who is capable of uniting with the divine soul, like Brunhild's? Only a true hero. So, it was predestined who would unite with her. And, in fact, she asks her father why all of that was happening, and he tells her everything that had been happening since the beginning of time. This part is beautiful, where he says, "Look, there is a ring that is in the wrong place. And it needs to be returned to its place." Right. And for that, a hero must arise, a warrior must emerge. And for that to happen, this young man needed to be born. But for that, he needs you. So, everything has been planned since the dawn of time. Nothing happens by chance. Wotan himself explains a bit to her, because she asks, and he tells her everything he intended with all of this. That boy was already predestined to recover the ring, return it to its rightful place, and bring forth a new humanity. To establish justice, to put everything in its proper place, and to elevate humanity to a new level. And then she falls asleep within that wall of fire. And time passes. Who lived near the dragon's cave, do you remember? Mime. So here she is, another beautiful scene. This work contains so many beautiful images, it makes you want to turn each one into a painting. And now comes Follow Fritz. It's only the third part. You're not too desperate yet, are you? Now it goes by faster. Follow Fritz. In that cave near the dragon's cave, Mime lived in a very humble hut. And he, who was always around there, scheming something to try to defeat the dragon, thinks she is a woman. A beautiful woman. Perfect, with a stature far above that of ordinary mortals. A very special woman, it was clear that she was not someone ordinary. He had already heard about the Joel Sungos, and she was certainly one of them. Expecting a baby, he thought, this child could be the hero I need to slay that dragon. My problems would be solved. Also, the blacksmith finds the 2 pieces of knot hung, a work of art. He had never seen anything so perfect. So he gathers up the little boy, collects the sword, and takes everyone home. She gives birth to the boy and passes away, and he raises this child. And throughout his entire life, he keeps trying to forge that sword. The sword that represents the divine will, but he does not possess divine will, he is weak. So, every time he tries to forge it, it breaks. He tries to forge it, and it breaks again. He never succeeds, because his whole life is spent trying to unite the pieces of Notunga, and the young man grows up. A strikingly handsome young man, perfect, a truly perfect hero, who, of course, had nothing in common with that dwarf, and the dwarf would present himself as his father. He did not believe it. He would say, "You have nothing to do with me. You are clumsy. You have nothing to do with me, and yet you tell my story." Until, at a certain point, when he reaches a certain age, there is a moment described where he would bring wild animals home, just to provoke fear. What disgusted him about himself was weakness, submission, cowardice. Then, when he reaches a certain age, he is told, "Come here, all right, I am not your father. Your mother passed away when you were born and left her sword for you." He quickly unifies the pieces of the sword. Mime never succeeded, but on his first try, he puts it together, restores Nothung, and has the divine will. Then Mime says, "There is a mission for you, to slay a dragon and recover a ring that lies within. I only want the ring. The glory of slaying the dragon will be yours." So, adventures, how great. He was waiting for this. Then, armed with this sword of divine will, he heads to the dragon's cave. The dragon emerges, ferocious as ever, never before challenged. He was in a battle with great ease because he was very brevi, didn't know fear or even what fear was. He manages to slay the dragon. Interestingly, through an ancient ritual that takes place, and similar stories exist, he bathes in the dragon's blood. However, as he bathes in the dragon's blood, a leaf falls onto his back. Just below the nape of his neck, a leaf lands. That spot is not touched by the dragon's blood. Do you remember Achilles? His mother dipped him in the river, making him completely invulnerable, except for the heel where she held him. In other words, he is entirely endowed with the powers of nature that he has subdued. Isn't the dragon a symbol of the powers of nature? He subdues the powers of nature, he carries willpower, but he has a vulnerable point. And, just like Achilles, it is through this vulnerable point that he will perish. When he bathes in the dragon's blood, when he immerses himself in these powers of nature, he comes to understand the language of nature. And a bird speaks. It tells him, "Look, do not give this ring to Neve. He is planning to poison you. This man is corrupt. Do not give it to him." And then, indeed, when he approaches Mime, he sees that Mime is setting a trap for him with a very shifty look. He realizes that what the bird had said was true. So he ends up killing Mime and continues walking alone. That bird speaks, and he feels very lonely, without family, without anyone. "I know a woman who is perfect for you." "You do?" "Yes, a perfect lady meant for you. You can marry this lady." And where is she? She is at the top of a mountain, asleep in the midst of a wall of fire. Great, more adventures. Isn't that right? For a hero of that caliber, the more adventure, the better. And he climbs up there and, indeed, with great ease, he crosses the wall of fire and comes upon the sleeping maiden. A woman beautiful, perfect, magnificent, clearly the woman destined for him. Her soul was divine, for she was a goddess fallen to earth. And he awakens her, and the two become hopelessly in love. He places the ring on her finger and creates a protective barrier there, forming that wall of solar fire. That's our illustration a bit further ahead, isn't it? Let's go through our images. Here, when he forges the sword, the dragon, there are many representations of the dragon, the meeting of Brunhild. The beautiful Brunhild. And then he gives her the ring. And naturally, since he is a hero, he feels the need for adventure. And she understands this. You have the need to travel the world, to accomplish great deeds. I understand this. I will not hold you back here. So, she remains within the wall of fire, as if it were her home. He goes out into the world, living out adventures. And then it's interesting, because at a certain moment, when he leaves, his sisters, the divine Valkyries, enter that wall of fire and ask her to give up the ring, so that they can return it to the kingdom. Because this would greatly shorten the suffering of humanity. But she too is already contaminated. She too becomes entangled in the destiny of humanity, also touched by desire. She sees the ring as the symbol of Sigrid's love for her and refuses to give it up. This greatly complicates the situation. It is at this moment that her sister tries to take the ring from her, but she refuses. She refuses to hand over the ring. Well, in one of these moments, the fourth part of the saga begins, which is the twilight of the gods, already approaching the end. You'll notice that Alberico and Mimi have just died Alberico too. But they had a terrible desire, the desire of dwarves, humanity, to possess this ring. So, have you ever stopped to think, what exactly is this ring? I don't know if you've noticed, but many traditions feature rings within which humanity is trapped. You've probably heard of the Ouroboros, Samsara, or even Jormungandr itself, a serpent from Scandinavia, serpent that bites its own tail. It is the manifested world, the prison of manifestation, with its desires, its illusions, and its fantasies. The ring is the ring of manifestation of the manifested world. With its deceptive gold, desires, misleading possessions, passions, within which man is imprisoned and from which he will not be freed until he lets go of it. As long as one does not let go of material things, of the material world, of manifestation, humanity will not be freed from suffering. And it seems that everyone who enters there becomes contaminated by this same desire for things, material things. And so begins the final part, which is the twilight of the gods. Alberico, that little dwarf, started the whole story. He had a son, Hagen, and this son was not with any woman, but with the queen, Kriemhild. And this Kriemhild, who was the queen of the Gibichungs, she went on to have two more children, Gunther and Gutruna, who are half-siblings to Hagen, the son of Alberich. And Hagen receives from his father the mission to take revenge on the Welsungs. Everyone in this story wanted to take revenge on the Welsungs and claim the ring for themselves. And Hagen inherits this mission, this envy, this hatred, this wrath from his father. And, for that purpose, he will use his two siblings, Gunther and Gutruna, to entangle an ambush, because he knows that the ring is with Siegfried. He knows that there is still a Welsung alive in the world, and he wants to reclaim that ring. So he plots with his brother. He tells his brother, Gunther, who was quite innocent, that there was a marvelous woman who lived within a wall of fire, and that she was the only woman worthy of marrying him. Then Gunther, not brave, how cross fire and win her. No, you can't, but there is a man who can go in there and get her for you. And then they say, well, who is this man? And Hagen had managed to retrieve that helmet once the dragon was slain. He was able to recover the helmet of invisibility, the helmet of shape-shifting. He says, look, we need to get this hero. When he passes through here, have him put on this helmet, take your form, and cross that wall of fire as if he were you. And claim this lady for you, because only this lady is worthy of you. And so he convinces his brother to carry out this scheme. And they plot that when Siegfried passes by, they will involve him in this plan. But how could they convince Siegfried to give up Brunhild herself, the woman he loved, the woman who was his very own divine soul? How could they persuade him to surrender what was most sacred to him? They managed to do this through a potion, part of Hagen's scheme. So they wait for Siegfried to pass by. And they very cordially invite him to visit the kingdom, to visit the court, to visit Gunther's castle. And there he is treated very well and forms a bond with Gunther. They make a pact of friendship, a blood pact, where both cut their own fingers, join their blood, and thus seal their friendship. In this moment, Gunther gives him a drink, which is a magical potion that makes him completely forget about Brunhild. And he ends up falling hopelessly in love with Gunther's sister, Gutruna. And he drinks this potion, and the potion takes effect. He forgets about Brunhild herself. He forgets his very own soul. He forgets everything he had experienced after he killed the dragon. In other words, the evil that defeats Siegfried is forgetfulness. Do you remember Merlin talking about this? The greatest evil for humanity is forgetfulness. It is what makes us forget our very own soul. He forgets what is divine within him, and he truly does forget. And then, Gunther, seeing that Siegfried had fallen in love with his sister, just as planned, says, "Look, I have a condition for granting my sister's hand in marriage to you. You will put on this helmet, take on my form, cross a wall, and retrieve a young woman who is there, and I'll bring her to myself." And he blindly does this, remembering nothing. He goes, disguises himself as Gunther with the helmet, and crosses the wall, because only he had the ability, the nobility, to cross the wall of fire. When Brunhild sees a different man entering the wall, he claims her for himself. She has no way to resist, because that was the law. Whoever crossed the barrier had the right to marry her. She is taken, along with him, to the kingdom, and only when they arrive in the kingdom and he removes the helmet does she realize she has been deceived. That Siegfried had brought her to another man, and that Siegfried was with another woman. And she feels fiercely offended by this, wounded by it. She does not realize that the hero had lost his memory, that he had forgotten who he was, and she does not understand this. Then, at a certain moment, she herself reveals to Hagen. Hagen approaches her, sensing her anger and her revolt, taking advantage of it. She herself reveals to Hagen what Siegfried's weakness was. He had a spot that had not been touched by the dragon's blood. So, they take Siegfried on a hunt, and at a moment when he bends down to drink water, he is murdered by Hagen. In the moments before he dies, he regains his memory. He remembers Brunhild, he remembers his past, he remembers who he was. He regains his memory and dies with her name on his lips. And then, Brunhild arrives and takes the ring, returns it to the Rhine maidens, which is what should have been done from the very beginning, and asks for a great funeral pyre to be built, so that Siegfried can be cremated, a great pyre, as was fitting for a hero of his greatness. And then, a beautiful moment, Siegfried's funeral march by Wagner, truly beautiful. The funeral pyre is prepared. And Brunhild mounts her Valkyrie horse, Grain, and throws herself into the pyre along with him. And the two are consumed by the flames together, merging into one through the fire. This luminous, vertical, transcendent fire fuses the two into one. Then, Siegfried regains his memory in his final moments and unites with his divine soul. That devastating fire above, Wotan was already aware of it. He orders branches from the ash tree to be gathered and placed around the castle of Asgard, around the castle of Valhalla, around Asgard itself, because he knows that Asgard will catch fire. And he waits. It was necessary. Then, this fire catches on the ash tree, the axis of the world, and sets all the worlds ablaze. Asgard burns, the gods perish, and almost all humans die. and this world is reborn, purified. A pure god reigns, Balder reigns, a world guided by Balder and inhabited by men who are all like Siegfried. Noble men, bathed and purified in fire. Men who, through fire, have united with their divine soul. The luminous fire of a superior mind, of an elevated mind, of a mind with wings, which, through divine will, by passing through all the trials, means it unites with its divine soul, and is reborn, purified in the other world. And thus is the twilight of the gods. The fire destroys and renews. And there it is, our Siegfried upon the funeral pyre. And a new world is created. You remember that, for the Scandinavians, there are still 3 more worlds ahead. Mimi, Vidblin, Algelang. In other words, every time humanity needs to be reborn, purified, the world will be reborn along with it. Here, a world of the Welsons is born. A world of people like Siegfried, like Sigmund, and like Sieglinde. Well, basically this is the story. As I mentioned to you, it is very rich in symbols. It speaks of the renewal of humanity through values, through divine will, divine love, the purification of the mind, the elevation of consciousness, and the perception of the divine within oneself. This is the rebirth of a new humanity. This is what this myth speaks about. The fusion, as I mentioned to you, created by Wagner, makes use of original elements. There is nothing that he invented. And the story is extremely rich. It is the story of humanity itself, according to this perspective, according to this tradition. For me, it is one of the most beautiful myths we know, in its complexity and in the promise it holds of a recreation of a purified humanity, of a purer, nobler, and more divine human being. Of course, this has suffered many materialistic and very crude interpretations. Later on, but in truth, what Wagner wanted to express was not about a physical race, as many later claimed, but about a moral race. A race of the soul and not of the body. Of people renewed from within, not from without. And, as always, it is interpreted in whatever way one wishes, as has happened so many times throughout history. That is basically what I wanted to share with you, and now I open the floor for questions. In truth, death itself is a passage. In fact, I used to show a video before the last lecture where the hero dies and is reborn in order to be purified. Now, Arthur does not die. Remember that Arthur lives in Avalon eternally. He waits for his knights to bring good news so that he may return to reign over the world. Siegfried dies and is reborn, like his father. His father died, but he was reborn as Siegfried. By going through all the necessary trials, he is reborn as Siegfried. Siegfried dies and is reborn as an even purer being in another world. It is as if each new level is the death of consciousness on one plane and its rebirth, purified, on another. This is the ancient myth of the hero. These transitions are always present.